School is in. But are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with The Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share. And share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on The Awakening Educator.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Awakening Educator. My name is Megan Sweet. I'm here with Susan Andrian, as always. And today we are in show 4 of our equity series. And today we're talking with somebody who's going to help us to understand more about how to take equity and bring it to an organization. So we've talked a lot about different people's perspectives, but it can often be really challenging for organizations to actually make the bridge between wanting to talk about equity and be more equitable and actually create the systems and structures that will help that to be effective. And our guest today will help us to talk about that. Our guest is Lisa Jimenez, who is an impact-driven, equity-focused professional and an experienced executive with a demonstrated history of working in the education management industry. Lisa's areas of expertise include diversity and inclusion, organizational transformation, complex systems change, leadership and cross-functional team development, executive coaching, and facilitation. Lisa is passionate about transforming organizations for a more just society. Lisa recently founded OLAS Performance to address the high demand for developmental support to move beyond superficial equity training and instead transform organizations into liberatory spaces for both their own employees and for those they serve.
I'm so excited to have Lisa here today. In preparing for the show, we talked a lot about equity work and what we've seen in our years in education. And one of the things that always seems to be missing is how do you actually make it happen? So how do you take that professional development or that idea or that intention and actually bring it to life? So I'm really excited that we'll be talking with Lisa about that today. Susan, do you want to share a little bit about how this fits in with the larger context of this series?
So as I said, Lisa is the fourth. We decided that the equity was so important that we needed to add a fourth rather than our typical 3-part series. We started with Crystal, who was a student of Megan's, who talked about her experience of equity from the student perspective, and she's also an author. We're really excited. Her book has just recently been released and is available on Amazon.
Wow.
Pumpkin Learns to Read?
Learns to Read, yeah.
Yeah, so that's exciting, and you can find a link to her book on our website. And then we talked with Leroy Gaines, who was a principal in Oakland and is now running for Oakland School Board in a pretty tight race in District 5. And so we were really excited to hear from him about his perspective and talking about equity, both from a principal point of view and also thinking about it from a district level. And our third in the series was with Rochelle Rogers-Ark. And we talked with her about leadership and equity in leadership and supporting leaders of color and really the experience that they have in a system that sometimes is difficult, and sort of having very frank, clear conversations about supporting our leaders of color and making sure that the leadership of our district reflects our students and our community. And now we're topping that off with our conversation with you, Lisa. So we're super excited to be here and talk about how do we move from the idea of equity, how do we move from the idea of making sure every kid and every family gets what they need to thrive. How do we set up our systems so that we can then measure that and make sure that what we're trying to do is actually working?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I was so excited when I got the invitation and then talking to Megan, this is such juicy content. And I think it's a conversation that's often missed, and is so important to talk about, because we're all sitting in the context of organizations. And so unless, really from my perspective, unless we are working as a collective organization to move the needle, very little changes. What ends up happening, we have spots of excellence, and we have an excellent teacher in the classroom, an excellent leader, an excellent central office administrator. But our entire system isn't moving forward, because, as cliche as it sounds, it can be true. We have islands of excellence, and we don't have a system of excellence. I think my thinking has really changed in the last 6 months, from an external notion of excellence. How are we creating that in the places and spaces that we lead in the district? To a much more internal, how are we actually creating that within our teams and our organization for ourselves? Mm-hmm. So I'm wrestling with some of that right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things that we talked about, Lisa, before the show was, and it's happening a lot right now, actually, with it's the blessing and the challenge of this moment around having Black Lives Matter initiatives become so popular. And I think folks, because of all of what's been happening, for centuries in the United States, both in the last few years under this administration, heightened awareness for folks around what's happening to people of color, harm done to them, and the inequities that have been there and the people of color have experienced for a long time. So now there's this new or renewed focus on bringing equity work to schools and communities. But what we were both noticing before, and I'd love to hear your reflections on this, is that the way folks are going about it actually can cause more harm sometimes, or because it's like jump right into the deep end of the pool. Like we're gonna go in and everyone's gonna talk about their identities. We're gonna have a trust fall, and that doesn't work. So either that, or or these pockets where it's happening in a few places and people aren't touching it and going enough depth. And so, and when you do that, when you introduce this idea of equity, but then you don't do it in a deep way, that often then reharms or causes deeper harm for people of color, and creates deeper alienation. So I'm just wondering what your reflections are on that. And we had a longer conversation, but what sense do you make of that, especially somebody who held a lot of district level PD and seen those systems?
Mm-hmm. It's such an interesting question. And honestly, I think this has always been happening. What we're really talking about, both on a political spectrum, but also internally in organizations, this has always existed. These issues, the feelings, the marginalization of folks of color in our own districts, and I say that even if you have a more diverse district, we've all been part of those parking lot conversations after PD or after the meeting. And they have most always been around racism, systemic racism and oppression within our own organizations. So I really just want to recognize the long-term nature of that question, and that we've been always dealing with this. I think that there's some differences, certainly in the scale and the intensity right now, and certainly in the visibility. But part of the harm is for folks who haven't always perhaps been in the struggle, or had the awareness, is there's this, I remember, reading this article of just the pain of waking up, and that waking up, quote unquote, is causing a great deal of harm, which I think is what you were talking about. And so I think we have a responsibility for folks who have been doing this work for a while, to hold that. We need to be a force field for some of the harm that is happening. We need to be able to name some of those harmful actions within our own organizations. And we need to be able to lift up that this is not a new challenge. This has been an ongoing challenge, and that maybe certain people have not recognized the challenge, felt the challenge, known about the challenge, but that certainly for our colleagues of color, the challenge has always been there. And so the harm is heightened now, I think, because of the scale, the volume, and the intensity. But we do we can do some real damage to long-term equity work to think it is a moment in time or this is a quote unquote new issue.
Right.
And at the same time, as we have people quote unquote waking up, how do we engage them in a conversation in a way that actually brings more people into the movement? Certainly collective movement in our communities, but within our own movements and organizations, how can we bring them into the fold and engage them in a way that isn't perpetuating and causing harm?
Yeah. There's so much to unpack there.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. You know, because I've been dipping. There's the worldwide embodiment conference is happening right now, and many of the many of the workshops are free for a period. So I've been popping in and out of a few. And yesterday I went to Prentice Hemfrell's workshop. And they were talking a little bit about this, like tension between the internal and the external, what's happening in our community, and then the internal work, and how the internal work is really driving, and especially in this time as folks are starting to wake up, and there is a pain associated with that, and then there are folks that have been doing this work, and where we all are in the process, and how the being centered or grounded in where we are in our own space and our own work is so incredibly important as we collectively start to unpack the systemic ways in which inequity has been the water in which we're swimming.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And people are trying right now to kind of draw some conclusions and to create solutions for what is historically and currently one of the most complex challenges of our time. And I think we want to do that because we want to be able to understand a complex problem and feel efficacious in what we do to work on the complex problem. But I don't think complex problems need complex solutions. And so just like as a specific example, like within an organization, you know, there's, I don't know if you have experienced this, but what's started to happen, and I say this for folks kind of newer to the work, is, you know, don't ask colleagues of color about X. Don't ask communities of color to help you learn, if you're not from that community, about X. And while I think that's significant and important, what I think is so important inside our own organizations is that we actually look to solutions from folks who are impacted by the issues that we want to solve. And whether that is you as a colleague, talking to fellow colleagues, whether that is you as a person with privilege and power in your organization to talk to your boss, your leader. For me, often that's about using my own power and privilege to break down doors. Sometimes I do that softly and gently and, you know, craftily. And sometimes it involves like just really, really breaking through, you know, just banging that door down with a lot of noise. And ensuring that we're having dialogue about the issues to ensure that we're creating a solution that's locally relevant. It's good to look at themes, and it's good to look at broad strokes, perhaps, of understanding an issue, but to the kind of point of the podcast, you know, how are we creating systemic change in our organizations? We really have to lean into our local community and our local colleagues to be coming up with those solutions that are going to be relevant for our organizations. I think it's also a really important and critical time for leaders and organizations to take a stand. I'll be very blunt to say that even some of our leaders who consider themselves to be the most woke, I say that in all its meanings, they're really struggling to admit that perhaps they're not as woke as they have thought they are. And that can be a really dangerous place. And so one of the biggest tools I think we have in our toolbox in this work is humility. We don't arrive at knowing. And when we lose that sense of humility in our work and inquiry, I think it's a really dangerous place. And I think that our leaders in our organizations need to step up and make this non-negotiable for their organization. And they need to send a very clear message to their teams that it is non-negotiable, and that they're willing to stand in the challenge of what that means. Because I've heard so often, oh yeah, we're down with your equity work. You know, we're all about this. And then when you actually dig into real, meaningful, deep equity work, you're talking about interrupting the status quo. And so then you'll hear, well, we didn't mean that.
Right.
Okay, so you meant quasi-equity work? You meant you wanted to make some comfortable changes.
Right.
I'm not sure where the equity and interruption of systemic oppression is in comfort.
I love you named a few things. I was writing them down as you were talking. One of the things you said was, so how do you, because this is what we have in organizations. I think you're describing the challenge really beautifully, which is we have primarily white people who are waking up. Some have been awake for a while, and that's a different kind of set of issues perhaps, or
Yes.
opportunities. But so we have, in this moment in time, a lot of white people are waking up to their privilege and power and of what's been happening. And so how do you do some induction for them with care, so that they are waking up in a way that's responsible and respectful, both to themselves, but also to people of color, and understand the nuance between asking someone about their experience versus relying on people of color to teach them about what it is to be oppressed, which is two different issues, right? So there's that side. And then how do you honor on the other side people of color who, you're right, have been experiencing this forever, who have been experiencing these challenges forever, and how do you keep them in a space where that's honored and treated with care, and not have them burn out, right? So I don't want to have this conversation one more time, or I think there can be this real tenderness of I actually just can't go there anymore. And that's the thing that's been breaking my heart the most, on Facebook posts and everything else, is just the expression of exhaustion that I'm hearing from a lot of my friends of color of I can't anymore. So that's the tension, because you're in these organizations that have these two poles, and then in between there somewhere, and I was thinking about this morning, I think where the most dangerous people are the woke people who don't realize how woke they aren't, because they see themselves that way, but they don't realize how much they're missing, and therefore I think maybe they won't on some level they're not even aware, but they can't see actually the harm they're causing in not being able to go there all the way. So I love that acknowledgement of we need humility. So we need to be able to create spaces where there's humility, where we can trust each other and call each other out and have those conversations, and in organizations where they're really dynamic. So I'm just wondering how you start to go about, that's a big mix to hold, and it's what we need to do. It's the work, I feel in the country. So, in 30 minutes, if you could solve that problem for us, I'd be so happy. But as you start to think about it, if you enter into a school setting, are there look-fors for you or early moves that you feel we should make when we're imagining bringing equity to an education system?
There's so many. I'm kind of mulling over, where's the starting place to answer that question?
Right.
Because my answer, I think, truly would have been different a year ago. And I think I've always had a personal challenge about pacing, always being more intense, more urgent than many of the contexts that I've led in. And so I personally, right, you're laugh of recognition. Oh, right. I remember that. So I personally am very excited about the sense of urgency. And yet, if we haven't created the conditions for this work to build on, that's where I think we can risk so many of the things that you both actually have mentioned over the course of our conversation. So, I mean, one thing is really thinking about what conditions exist in the organization to do this work, and accepting the impossibility of neatness. This is not tidy work. And I so often see organizations with all the bells and whistles, and we've all been part of them. And when it comes past the trainings, you mentioned trainings in the beginning, and I've always had issues with equity trainings, but I'm enraged about them right now, in full transparency, because
Not good, but I get it.
I know, right? But it goes to your question. In many places and spaces, that's the answer. So we haven't done some of the time and the work of setting conditions for people to be ready. And I don't mean setting conditions for 5 years to be ready. I just mean some basics around readiness. And then there is urgency that translates into trainings. And in some of the spaces that I've worked in, whenever I ask the question, what are you doing for equity? How are you moving the equity needle? How are you addressing racism in your organization? I will tell you, in the last 6 months, the answer that I've gotten more than any other answer is training. And I just, I have to take a really deep breath and really be so thoughtful about what comes out of my mouth next.
Right. Well, I also think it really depends on what that means by because I agree that
Yes.
that the sort of diversity training or the sort of that surface level, like checking the boxes for we're doing our equity trainings, everyone's going through it, but at the same time we need to have these spaces, and in education there is so little space for reflection and growth. And that teachers are like running a million miles an hour, administrators are running a million miles an hour, and actually the only spaces where the work can take seed is in the professional development realm. So the question isn't, are you doing training? It's what do we mean by training? Right? Like what is happening in those spaces? What data are we using? And as someone who wasn't a big data fan, I'm a mental health person, and I had to, I'm all about feelings and relationships, which, I have grown to love data, because it doesn't matter how comfortable I feel or how close I might feel. If we are not creating spaces where kids are learning in equitable ways, you can feel really connected, but in the end, when you graduate from school, if you're not ready to take the next step, whatever that next step might be, we're actually not creating equitable spaces. And so I've grown this love for data, and we were talking about it today, and I know you're coming from you have a background in language and dual language and multi-language, and thinking about our English language learners and how many of our students are unnecessarily remaining long-term English language learners, and how we're not engaging families in ways that we're not giving enough appreciation for multi-language families, and that's actually an asset. And so I mean, I know I'm going in a million different directions, but I think we can't throw out professional learning, because that is the only space we have with our professionals and educational systems. Otherwise, it's moving too fast. It's what are we doing with that space, and how are we pushing the reflective process and using data and using sort of outcomes, as it doesn't matter. Like in my department, we've done all kinds of work, and we brought suspension rates down, and we brought expulsion rates down, but the disproportionality in terms of equity has been stable and consistent. So,
well, I'd say I think training is important, but I guess, and I know you didn't ask Lisa a question, but I can't help myself now. I'm going to jump in. This is what I just keep thinking about, which is, you can't get a lot out of the training if you don't have basic trust communication. It's all the below the green line stuff that we don't, that kind of gets blown off, right? But if I can sit and look at data, but if I can't call out like it happened just the other day, actually, I was watching a school board meeting and the staff were like running through the data, but their language was really harmful to the people about whom they were using the data, and like painful. And so like data alone isn't enough, but and I don't know the staff person, so I can't talk to them. But like what we need is like, hey, you know, when you use this language, this is how it gets heard. And then when I hear that, this is what happens to me, which is I shut down, I shut off, and I go away. And therefore the conversation can't get past a certain point, because then we kind of retreat because it's too painful. So, so I think PD is one of our means in education. Maybe that's one of our challenges. Like that becomes the place where we do it, and then we try and cram everything in there. Right. But we don't spend enough time building the relationships and the capacity for us to actually, you know, we use a framing in my organization, calling each other in. Like, hey, when you said this, to be my colleague and ally, I need you to know this is how this felt for me, and for folks to have the capacity to do that, because then we can actually perhaps make some mistakes and say things wrong. I don't know.
I feel like it gets back to Lisa's original point of complex problems need complex responses. And so with that idea, thinking about what, from your perspective, because all of those, it can't be just professional learning. It can't just be data. It can't just be relationship, right? We need the above and the below the green line. So what, from your perspective, what are some of the ways that we start to untangle and create complex responses to complex situations?
I think that, I mean, again, no simple answers here, so we'll give that caveat. So I appreciate, so we're in training very little as educators. And so I want to push back. I mean, I don't want to get stuck on training. There's like a whole rabbit hole there with effective PD and training. I think that's where some of my thinking has really been transforming. And I've always struggled with this. I just think maybe now I feel more permission to live in this space, which is we're out of PD most of the time as educators. Yeah. And racism, sexism, classism, anti-Semitism, you name it, are existing everywhere all day in the organizations that we're living in. And so frankly, if you want to like measure these oppressive practices, they happen least during in the scope of an educator's life, whether you're a teacher, central office, superintendent. The least time that we're experiencing that is in a PD, because we're in PD the least amount of time. And so I think that's when we're looking at systemic change in organizations. Yes, all of that's important and serves a purpose and a place, and we could have a whole other podcast about what's effective PD. But what I think is more important are some of the other things you mentioned, which is, you know, what are our experiences in our organizations outside of PD? Because when I'm talking to colleagues and we have that parking lot conversation where someone needs to go off because of what they just experienced walking through central office building that's racist, oppressive, etc. You know, that's all the air we breathe every single day. It's in hallway conversations, it's in emails, it's in phone calls, it's in the meetings that we go in, how they're led. It's in who's lifted up in our organizations as leaders. There's a lot of challenges around what people are seen and not seen as instructional leaders, and how are you promoted and how are you lifted up? How are you given opportunities to develop? Are you even seen that you have any value to be developed? And I can't tell you the number of times where that's all broken out along racial lines. Who I've seen promoted, who I've seen developed and brought under somebody's wing, from hiring practices, from our classroom practices to principal leadership practices at their schools. So I think if we're really going to be interrupting, and I think racism is certainly the most salient issue for this conversation, but I also want to name intersectionality, and I want to name that we're living in a time with heightened issues to the public eye. They have always existed, but heightened issues across so many different intersections of gender and class and sexism and all of those. It's very complex, but I think we have to address this in every place and space in our organizations. It doesn't just get addressed in PD and then we go walk out into this this
absolutely,
and that's what I want to push on that in organizations, because that is where so much of the harm happens, and where there's so many opportunities that are limited. I think a lot of the conversation that Kendi has shifted around racist policy, and what is, if you put his lens over and he really interrupted our dialogue around institutionalized racism, systemic racism, and he's like, this is all right. This is all our anti-racist work, and actually those issues are those naming of the different oppressions are redundant. And I think that lens is so important as we look to transforming organizations, because that is what is manifesting. And I think we're at a time where if we aren't anti-racist in our organizations in every place and space, there's a problem. And it's always been there. But my question is, what are we going to do as leaders to stand up and have an internal organizational coalition where we're out of PD, we're making these changes, and we're changing the air we breathe, the water we swim in, as it may be. And I think, recently, I love that, I feel like NEP there's just this volume of writing that I'm seeing and reading right now. And I was just reading Rebel Leadership over last weekend, rereading the article again. And really and then with the podcast coming up, what it really made me think of is we really need rebel organizations. And what she writes in her article is, rebel leadership requires us to make inequities visible, disrupt discourse, practices and policies that perpetuate harm, and create new ways to engage and co-design with our communities so that each of us and our children can develop, thrive, and experience a sense of belonging. Rebel leadership now requires that each of us see the system, engage, and act differently than ever before. And I really think of that about the creation of the organizations that we're living in.
Yeah, that's so powerful, Lisa. Every time you say something, I want to stop. I keep forgetting that we're in a podcast, and I'm supposed to ask you a question back, because what I want to do is I want to sit and marinate on that for a minute. So the pauses are I'm kind of I love your framing around it. And I think that your point is so well taken around, PD becomes the mechanism that we focus on, but you're right. It's the smallest amount of the day that we have, and with our kids. And Susan, you started talking about embodiment and what an embodied leader is. It's the work that I've been doing in my organization too, of it's the everyday, it's the every moment, how you're moving through your day and your world that feels important.
One of the powerful moments for me in this work was reading Resmaa Menachen's work on my grandmother's hands, and really thinking about the way in which the pre-thinking part of our body, the pre-cortical part of our body, our nervous systems are interacting with each other, and how much of what's happening in equity and racism and sexism and all the intersectionalities is the way in which this is living in our nervous system, and in ways that we're not completely aware of. And Prentice, yesterday when I was in that workshop, they defined depression as the organizational. I want to make sure I say it exactly right, but it's the organizational distribution of trauma that increases the likelihood that a person will experience trauma or be exposed to traumatic situations. And I found that so powerful because, we talk about oppression in these sort of ways in which someone's subjugated but we are creating these systems in which large groups of folks are more likely to be impacted by trauma and then have be exposed to traumatic situations, and then we often then blame that community for acting in ways that are trauma related, while we're creating the systems and the structures in the organization that are creating the traumatic experiences that they are experiencing.
Right. Yeah.
So in thinking about that, and thinking about Kendi's work, like you're back to your question, or back to your point around we're either racist or anti-racist, right? We cannot be neutral. And within the organization, understanding that so much of this is living in our nervous system and is not in our thinking brain, how are we as educators and leadership interrupting those systems that are perpetuating the organization where people are being harmed?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have the answer? We don't have an answer. I think it's important to ask the question, but
I think actually that deserved a moment of silence.
Yeah.
And I think it's our collective responsibility, because you spoke so eloquently about the spaces in between.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where so much of harm is done, and that's where so much repair can also be done. I think we have to, and I feel like the answer to your question, anything I would say would oversimplify the beauty and the complexity of the question.
Mm-hmm.
So part of me just wants to let the question sit. But since we are on a podcast and we're here to answer questions, I think one is ownership, is really interrogating ourselves. It has to start with ourselves. And I think that if you are somebody who's done this work, we need parallel learning spaces. Mm-hmm. And so we need to create learning opportunities where folks who are coming to awareness and really want to be engaged and do more can engage in learning that is in a way that isn't going to cause harm to others and perpetuate harm. And I think that those of us who hold power and privilege, whether it's racial privilege, whether it's class privilege, or it's positional authority in your organization, there is a responsibility for us to be holding space to do that work. And I think some of it lives in the in-between spaces in the organization, right? And it can live in a simple conversation. It can live in a simple, hey, you want to grab some coffee? And it can live, at the kitchen, and where all of this, where all these things happen in the hallway on the way to the meeting. And so really doing our own personal work, but also taking our power and privilege and making sure that we're using it to answer that question, right? To impact what that would look like in our organization. And I frankly think there's a level of reproduction that until we change the way we do business and organizations is not going to stop, because the very similar to our kids, and we talk about this a lot, do we make change from within the organization? And then if we're in an organization that's oppressive, so actually we are part of that, whether we want to be or not, if I'm swimming in the water, or do we move outside an organization and work to impact? It's a personal question, I've just wrestled with for probably a decade. And it looks different, depending on where you're coming into the work. I think being unafraid to interrupt the status quo and to create more liberatory spaces is essential. I think being willing to take bold action that comes with personal sacrifice and personal harm is essential if you hold power and privilege, and if you have the positional authority in your organization. I don't know why the door analogy is coming to me so much right now, but to break down doors with less consequences, because there are people in the organization, and this is an oppression issue, who have the power and privilege to do things other people don't, with very, very different consequences.
Very different. Yeah.
But I think I would love to stay on the topic a little bit of faux wokeness.
Let's do it.
All right. I know Megan's going to like this topic.
I'm all about it.
She's all about
favorite.
this.
And I might find that I'm faux woke, which will be disappointing, but I'll work with it. But it's probably why it bothers me.
Well, it's this weird, like, dilemma, right? We need, as a culture and a community, we need people to start to pay attention to things they haven't paid attention to and feel like, you know, and part of that experience, the pendulum swings in terms of all of a sudden your identity is like, wow, I never knew that. I'm so woke. I didn't know this stuff was going on. But at the other end, we also need to hold them to task, right? Because they are taking up too much space that is sort of crowding out what we really, the depth of the work we need to do. So how might we, and what would you suggest around creating the space in the organization for those people that are newly becoming woke and having that sort of invigorating feeling, to capture that feeling in a way that doesn't repel folks that have been doing the work for a long time?
It's a hard one to answer because of how I feel about it. And I have two feelings, and I think they're probably worth naming because I'm sure I'm not alone. One is this real intense feeling of I want to lean into that, and I want to work with that person and support them and provide them opportunities to go deeper. Provide them opportunities where if you see some level of wokeness that is superficial, where they can have an opportunity to learn from other people, from other places and spaces, kind of a mirror up to see how they could go deeper in whatever the issue is that they're working with. And this real desire to like lean in and support the development and work with them on where they want to learn more and support them with opportunities to kind of enact some of the things that they're learning and lead from a different place. Say you're talking to school site and a principal, right? Or central office. But if I'm going to be really honest, I actually struggle because as much as there's moments where I feel like I'm at my best self or I want to lean in, there's moments where I'm like, what? You are, I did not just hear that. Right? And so we're all in our feelings about this work. And I think that's where the personal ownership comes with, you know, why am I having a strong reaction to this? Where do I need to exercise humility in my own work? And I really, you know, people ask, when did you start this? And I had to think about that. And really, I think all the way back to 16 in my own hometown community. And so I say that because even if you've been doing this work 30 years, there is never a moment we're done. There is never a moment where you have learned enough or where you understand the problem. And so I think some of the antidote to that faux wokeness is humility. And that, you know, to be a little bit cliche, but being a constant learner in the work. I think what's harder are people who have been doing the work and think they're further along than they really are. And they have a very hard time hearing that they're not as far along as they think they are. And some of those very people are causing great harm. And I think that's a real, especially in some of our Bay Area organizations where they really are, I don't know what we're measuring against, but you know, they are farther along in equity work and conversations, both quantity of people in the organization who are doing the work, but also years of practice of tackling these really tough issues. But it doesn't mean we're not reproducing oppression in our everyday work and interactions. And it doesn't mean we've ever arrived.
Right.
And so how are we constantly encouraging colleagues to grow and change? You know, and I can think of very specific examples where people who really identify as an anti-racist, equity-centered leader, and I'm thinking, you know, white folks, not folks of color, who really did not recognize their own racism and I share your feeling, Megan, of like horror, like, oh my God, please, you know, where I want to walk around with a mirror just in case that's ever me, right?
Right.
And there's a real danger of harm in that.
Absolutely. You know, you're making me think about a few things, but when we interviewed Leroy a couple of weeks ago, you know, again, my bias showed up real well. So I'll just name that. I was like, oh, African-American leader. He's going to talk about what it is to be a Black man in education. And he was like, no, I don't want to talk about that. And I was like, oh, okay, oops. first check on me. And he was like, what I want to talk about actually is the way, because he brought an interesting point up, which was in the Bay Area, we know what to say also, which makes it a little bit tricky. So we know the language that's appropriate and we know what we're supposed to say. Yes. And therefore it makes it sometimes harder to actually get underneath that because we know how to, we have a pretty good veneer. And so the way he went about the equity work at his school was to tackle LGBTQ plus inclusion because that was what he was seeing as the issue in his school community. So he used creating equity there and inclusion in that area to, you know, get to inclusion and equity on a larger scale. And I was like, that's so fascinating. And here I was, again, I just made a bunch of assumptions about what would feel most urgent for him, which I think that's the humility that you need, and you need it in action, and you need to be willing to model that. So I think you're right. We could all walk around with the mirror and be too afraid to say anything, or we have to be willing to be like, oh shoot, I did it again, you know, and name that. And I've had the privilege over the last couple of years. I work at an organization that we do mindfulness all the time, and I think that mindfulness, it gets like the squishy, soft like reputation, but I think it's one of those places where you actually can start to develop that awareness, because I think often people just aren't aware, and it's because they're so stuck in their head and their stories or in their fear or whatever it is. But if you can get to like a willingness to see what's happening, which mindfulness can help you to do, so that's my plug for mindfulness for the day. But, you know, on our team, what we do is we model when we mess up, and we model like saying it. And that's created a huge amount of change. And I remember one woman who identifies as Latina, she was like, she called herself out on her own bias about a different group. And she was like, look, see, I just did that. And she's like, yes. And it was a very soft, quick reflection of like, see how bias works. And it was welcoming. It wasn't shaming. It was just like, yep, this is how it shows up, and this is how it showed up for me right now, which I think, you know, those moments then make it safe for other people to name that for themselves as well. But I think where leaders step in is their willingness to own that, and it's a scary place. I mean, it's hard for me to name it when I do it as well, but I think that's the only way for leaders to start to shift the culture, because otherwise it's not safe. And I want to call out what you said before, which is parking lot conversations, because I will say for people in positions of power and who are like benefactors of the white supremacist culture, parking lot conversations don't happen very often. They do sometimes, but I just don't even like name that that's a thing, right? Because that's a group of people that don't feel connected, they don't feel seen in their organization, and they actually literally are outside of the space talking, processing, trying to work through it, but the people who are doing the harm are inside the building, and they're not getting it. So like, how do we bring those parking lot conversations into the building is the challenge.
There's one more piece of this that I think is important as a white woman that I think about a lot in this current moment around, and having conversations with friends and colleagues around what is part of my work in this is to be the person that's sitting with the newly woke or newly understanding, so that I may have those feelings, but my work in it is to be that person who can sit with it and protect other folks who are just exhausted in a different kind of way, right? And so part of it is my internal response to that is I don't want to be associated with that. Right, like I don't. Part of the frustration with the faux woke or the overly woke is I don't want to be lumped in with your ignorance, right? But I feel like that's the work for me to do, as in this work in a role that I can have in moving us forward as a culture, is that I can be the person who, with humility, can sit with and give people the space to make those mistakes and be gentle and pushing them to go deeper and pushing them to have that experience. And that it's almost like it's the responsibility of the true white ally to be able to sit in those spaces that are more exhausting that so other folks don't have to.
Yes. Yes. And I think a lot about advocacy rather than allyship. You know, I've been, again, just kind of struggling with all these different things that they've always been there, but I think just lifted up in this current time. And I think what you said is so important about, you know, what's ours to do in this time. Whoever you are, however you identify your place in space, but we're called to do something. And doing nothing is not an option. And I think the word white supremacy has been, you know, just historically such a charged word, but I actually think those are the kinds of things that we need to be naming and creating space for people to not shy away from those difficult conversations, because whether you're talking about it or not, all of these things are happening.
Yeah.
And, you know, what concerns me about this time is that I think that white thinkers around race issues are so important. But what concerns me about this time is the willingness of many folks to only look towards authors that they feel comfortable and safe and secure in reading and working with, rather than digging into really working more with authors of color who have been writing about this for centuries, who have done deep thinking on the problems of whiteness and who have done deep thinking on what that means and how that manifests in organizations. And so I think of Layla Saeed's work as such a critical, you know, everyone's talking about white fragility, but then I'm holding this other book that's like, actually, from her perspective as a woman of color, she is naming all of the things that we, you know, need to be working on, both in life, but in this case of our conversation, our organizations. And so I think just creating that learning space where the messiness can be held in a way that isn't going to cause damage, but also creating safe spaces within our organizations to hold the messiness of the work, because we can't actually get to healing, and we can't get to steal the rebel leadership idea, like a rebel organization, unless we are going to do this brutal, difficult work of coming to terms with our own racism. And how it manifests in the organizations that we're serving in, and how we actually perpetuate it no matter who we are at all levels of organization, because we exist within the very nature of an oppressive organization.
Yep.
Yes. That's like a mic drop moment. I think that's actually a very good one to end on. Boom. Yes, this is such a powerful conversation. I want to have like 5 more hours of it with you. And I haven't had a guest actually recently, and I've loved all of our recent guests, but you've given me so many things to work with in like words and phrases that I think are really helpful to hold as well. So for me, this has been really powerful for today. And that idea that we need to create spaces for things to get messy, and commit to discomfort, essentially. I guess. And ongoing discomfort, not like a one and done, not like a, you know, I'm gonna go to this PD and get it out, but like an ongoing, like
it mirrors clinical work. It mirrors the healing work. We need to do it on an organizational and a cultural level, right? Like the healing work of therapy or the healing work of whatever way we do our healing. And I want to make sure we're not professionalizing healing, but it's that same idea. We have to be comfortable with discomfort, like you were saying, Megan, but we have to be able to unpack it, which is kind of ugly and painful and disorienting, but it's also extremely healing and extremely powerful. And if it results in our kids experiencing safe spaces where they're able to thrive and learn, that's what we need.
That's why we're here.
I
think that's the painful part of education is, even who become some of our most damaging teachers, I just don't believe anyone enters into education with that plan. It's just too hard of a job for that to be like, you're going to harm some people by being a teacher. Like that's not the MO.
Nope.
And so I think it's also just is why we're here. So let's figure out ways to be different. I said that was your mic drop moment, Lisa, but we'd love to any final words or thoughts for you. That was a mic drop for me, but no pressure. Now that I've already said you had a mic drop.
I think I'd like to bring it back to the kids, and really why we're all here and why we ever got into this work in the first place. And my passion and my interest for healthy organizational systems for adults is because all of those adults are out serving our children. Mm-hmm. And how can we be called on to create the conditions for children to thrive? We don't often talk enough, and this is to your point of, really healing of our own self-care. And I think that creating safe organizations, rebel organizations, is a place of self-care where we give ourselves the fuel to serve our youth and to change outcomes for all the youth that we serve. But I prefer not to end on my own words, if you don't mind. And I think it's, given the topic, I think it's worth bringing an author of color in to have the last word.
Love it.
Go for it.
So I would, this is from Kendi's work. Once we lose hope, we are guaranteed to lose. But if we ignore the odds and fight to create an anti-racist world, then we give humanity a chance to survive, a chance to live in communion, and a chance to be forever free.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Class is dismissed. Wasn't that fun? Susan and Megan are always happy to greet you on the next episode of The Awakening Educator. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Education is the foundation for a brighter future. Open your eyes to The Awakening Educator.